Hi, everybody. Wayne Dorban here from Northern Colorado with our bi-weekly huddle and webinar. And we are so excited because today we've got Dr. Robert Howarth from the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Cornell University in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. And Dr. Howarth is not aware of it, but we've got a lot of So you're going to be hearing him today, and he'll be live, and we'll be able to answer questions if you have them. But also, he's going to be mainly, you're going to see a PowerPoint presentation that he has prepared for us, and then you're going to be seeing me a little bit, and then we'll go from there. Just a little bit of an update. It's been a wonderful last couple of weeks here at the ranch. As you know, a little over a month ago, we transitioned from our warehouse up here to our ranch location. It's been a great month of transition as we get in our facilities here up to speed and getting things put in place. It took us actually a couple weeks to get our internet throughout our campus here. Obviously, picture previously being in a 15,000 square foot building, and now we're in a multi-acre, hundreds of acres around us here ranch. And we're communicating between offices that are in different locations on that, and we pretty much got that under control. Sometimes we can't control the distance sort of stuff like we're doing with Dr. Howarth here today. Dr. Howarth, and again, would you like me to call you Dr. Howarth or Bob, or how would you like me to enter?
Bob is fine. I'm very happy to be with you today.
Well, awesome. We appreciate that. And are you there at the university today? Are you at an offsite office?
Nice and warm and summery, bright. Feels good.
Awesome. Well, we've had the same very wet summer, and Leigh-Ann, I will tell you that the light's not on that camera anymore. This one. So there we go. And then into the late part, and then it's been dry for the last week or so, but we're supposed to get rain again tomorrow. So we can use it though. We've had a drought out here for several years.
Right.
Well, again, excited to have you with us today, and I think what we're going to do is we're going to have some questions, and then you're also going to sort of give us a presentation from a PowerPoint that you have. You're going to see that Dr. Howarth or Bob's going to actually indicate to Leigh-Ann when he's ready to move on to another slide, because he's not able to see right where we're at in the PowerPoint. The audio signal's excellent though, Bob. And I think our listeners are going to have just a wonderful time here today. So
okay.
Let's just get right at it. I usually prepare a bunch of questions, and you've seen these. And if you could just maybe start out, tell us just a little bit about yourself, your current business and life situation, and then from that, I'll probably expand on a couple of questions, and then maybe ask you a little bit about your college years and so on, and then we'll just go right into your PowerPoint.
Okay, sure. I'm a professor at Cornell. I've been on the faculty here for 29 years. I'm an oceanographer by PhD level training, but I do a lot of research generally in the area of Earth system science and ecosystem biology. We have a nice large lab group. I work with my wife, Dr. Roxanne Marino, the co-lab organizer. We work on a lot of different topics, and the one I'd be most excited to explain in a little bit of detail with you today is some work we've done on methane emissions and how that makes natural gas a pretty dangerous fuel from the standpoint of global change. But I also, in the PowerPoint, put together some stuff from my early years, going back to late high school, to sort of give you a sense of how I developed into the type of scientist I am.
Why don't we jump into that? And before we do, just so you have a little context, it's kind of amazing how similar we're at. We're similar in age. Looks like you graduated from college maybe in 73 or 74, graduate school after that. Well, I graduated in 73, University of California, Irvine, and went to Scripps right after that, and in their Marine program. And you're going to go ahead and tell your story here, so why don't you go right into it, and Leigh-Ann will proceed through the slides kind of as you start to talk about it.
Well, let's go right to the second slide there. I didn't say where I went to college. I went to Amherst College. I was there for 1970 to 74, and I've got a little bit of information about there. But before I went to Amherst, I grew up in a very small town in rural New Hampshire, a town of 600 people, fairly near the seacoast. So I grew up loving the ocean and loving a rural environment. Went to a still pretty small regional high school. It covered multiple towns since my high school, there was no high school in my town. And towards the end of my time in high school, my very last year, 1970, that was the very first Earth Day, and I was one of the statewide organizers for the very first Earth Day in New Hampshire. And that earned me to go to the third slide here. And Leigh-Ann, you're going to have to apologize. I'll apologize to you, but I might just jump ahead without telling you, so watch me. On the third slide, there's this fellow, William Loeb, who used to run the largest state newspaper in New Hampshire. And on Earth Day, he ran a front-page editorial accusing me and 4 others by name as being communists for having organized Earth Day, which was a real eye-opener. And the reason I mention that is that I have always been an environmentalist, or recently become a scientist, obviously. I started off as a fairly conservative person from that rural New Hampshire background. My parents were Republicans. I probably thought of myself as a Republican, but once you're called a communist because you believe in taking care of the environment, that's a real eye-opener. So it caused me to start thinking more broadly. If we go to the next slide, number 4. While I was in college, Aristotle Onassis, who was a Greek shipping magnate and at the time one of the richest men in the world, tried to put a offshore oil unloading terminal off the coast of New Hampshire in a beautiful place called the Isles of Shoals, small island 6 miles off the coast. And I had spent a lot of my time earlier years on those islands and camped out there and things, and I just thought this was a horrific idea that you'd turn that into an industrial oil port. So I didn't personally get involved in that, but a lot of my friends who stayed home in New Hampshire, I was up at college in Massachusetts by then, organized action against it, and they were successful in closing it down. So that never happened. I'm happy to say those islands are protected now, and actually Cornell runs a marine lab on one of them. Beautiful place. Let's go to slide 5. After my junior year in college, I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to be a political science major or a biology major. I was interested in environment, but I didn't know if I wanted to be a scientist or a lawyer. But I got a chance to do an internship with George Woodwell, who at the time worked for Brookhaven National Lab. I worked with him on a salt marsh project for the summer of 1973. But Woodwell was one of the very first ecologists who was talking about the problems of climate change. He had written about it extensively already as of 1973, and talking about how deforestation in the Amazon, in addition to fossil fuel use, was a driver. And he did many things for me. He's been a role model for me ever since, basically. World-class scientist who cared about real-world issues, got involved, believed that you should use your science to advocate for what's necessary to protect the environment. So a very influential part of my life. Because of my involvement with him, I decided to go to graduate school and went on this science path I've been on ever since. So slide 6, a little bit more history here. I was in the joint program between MIT and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution for my PhD. I worked with John Teal, and primarily on salt marsh ecology. Teal was a notable salt marsh ecologist, and I did things like look at sulfur cycling, which led me into some acid rain research later. I looked at natural methane fluxes from this. We'll come back. I've been fascinated with methane ever since that work. And as I mentioned earlier, what I really want to spend the time on today is to tell you why methane is such a undervalued part of global change, but that's when I started thinking about it. Teal also encouraged me to work broadly on other issues, and he worked on other things among on oil pollution. And there's been an oil spill there on the coast of Massachusetts in 1969. So when I started graduate school in '74, there's still obvious ecological effects from it. The oil is still persisting, and in fact, the oil is still there today from that spill in 1969. But I, as a side project, got engaged in that and developed sort of a lifelong interest in looking at activities. Next slide, number 7 we're on. As one part of that, while I was still a graduate student, after the oil embargoes of the mid-1970s, the federal government decided to open up much more of the continental shelf to offshore oil. And for the first time ever, they proposed to develop oil off the New England coast, what they called OCS lease sale number 42, proposed in 1976. And I and a few other graduate students took on as a semester-long course the challenge of plotting through the environmental impact statement for that, which is a 5-volume tome of some 6,000 pages or something like that. And we published a critique because it was based on absolutely terrible science, and we got a fair amount of publicity for that publication, and I was invited to testify before the U.S. Senate on it. We were able to work with some environmental groups who sued the government over it, and we actually won in federal court. One of the very few times ever where science was able to actually force the government to come back on an environmental impact statement and stop an action. So there still is no offshore oil development off of New England, and our actions were part of that. Next slide, number 8. Again, still in graduate school, there was a tanker that broke up off the coast of Massachusetts in a winter storm, sort of like the perfect storm, in December of 1976, and I was lucky enough to be part of the scientific study that went out and tried to look at that. The little ship up there is the research vessel we went out on, the Oceana. We weren't able to do any real science because it was too rough, and in fact waves were breaking up over the entire ship. The captain resigned his commission at sea because he had sort of a nervous breakdown over his own ship safety. But it's sort of an eye-opener that how little we know about oil pollution, because it's typical that you either have no beforehand data or the conditions just don't make it possible to study, as was the case here. Jumping ahead a little bit in time to slide number 9. By this time I'd gotten my PhD and I'd worked in Woods Hole for a while as a staff scientist, but Cornell had hired me in 1985 as a professor, and along came the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Prince William Sound. At the time it was the largest oil spill ever in the United States, and it remained the largest one ever until the Gulf of Mexico BP blowout 4 years ago now. The state of Alaska hired me to work with the Attorney General's office. I was in charge as a consultant while also still working for Cornell. I was in charge of their sort of quality control assurance for the research on what the effects were, trying to make sure that any evidence we had would hold up in court. And that was very depressing in some ways because it was a massive spill and you could see incredible damage everywhere, and yet it was almost impossible to prove that there was much damage, and we can come back and talk about that later if you like, because of the difficulty one faces in a real world after disaster like that. How frustrating it is as a scientist to not be able to prove the obvious that's all around you. That, again, sort of a major moment in my life. Next slide. This is the last one of my background before I sort of jump up to some of the more current things we're working on. Slide number 10. I had another very interesting opportunity in Alaska. This was in 1993. And I was hired by Alaska Legal Services to be an expert consultant and help them in a court case that Native American tribes had brought against ARCO, which later became British Petroleum, so one of the world's largest oil companies. They were concerned, they being the Native Americans, that offshore oil development in Norton Sound was destroying their environment, and so they wanted to put a stop to that. In fact, there had not been much ecological damage. We weren't able to find any at all, but we were able to get subpoenas to go into the ARCO records, and we proved that ARCO had been lying to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, just falsifying. They're using illegal substances which are not allowed for drilling, discharging them into Norton Sound, and just completely fabricating records to EPA to cover that up. So the reason I tell you that story is that we proved that. We proved it before the case went to trial, and the resolution was that ARCO agreed to pull out of Norton Sound, relinquish other drilling rights, help make Norton Sound forever free of oil development, which it still is. But in exchange for that, what we had found out was to remain secret for at least 10 years, till at least 2003, so that ARCO wouldn't have their reputation besmirched as people who falsify the pollution that they do. And that's very common to this day in the oil and gas industry. There's a lot of secret deals, secret court decisions, etc. A real issue.
Bob, on this slide, just because some people, and it's a great slide showing the whole Alaska, sort of Russia, and even into Northwest Territories. Tell the folks and give perspective where the Valdez spill was in relationship here.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe use the Gulf of Alaska that down there in the picture and talk about where it is from there.
Yeah, because the Exxon Valdez spill was in the Prince William Sound, which is part of, it's off the Gulf of Alaska, as you say. It's the largest, huge bay-like area there towards the east in the main part of Alaska, so off the Gulf of Alaska. Norton Sound in this one is much further to the north and shown in red because it's a red king crab habitat, the particular map I happened to pick up. So much further north. One of the problems we had with looking at the Exxon Valdez spill is that there was absolutely no scientific study of what Prince William Sound looked like before the spill. So we went out there, and you could see that there were, the marine mammals were hurting for sure. There were a lot of dead sea otters which showed up. Did not find much in the way of other dead sea life because most things are eaten or decomposed right away when they're killed. Populations looked low, but there's nothing to compare it with because there's no pre-spill data. And so what you do if you don't have before event data is to look for some reference site or control site, something like Prince William Sound, but not oil, to see how it behaves differently. And there is no such thing. Prince William Sound is a very unique environment. There's really nothing quite like it ecologically anywhere else. And so, although it was obvious that the area had been just slammed by the oil spill, we were not able, in fact, to prove it in any meaningful way. And it's part of the reason the court case over that is still not settled decades later, and that's part of the reason why.
I just thought it'd be great to give the perspective, so thank you. Before we go into your current work, which I really want to give you a lot of time to talk about, let me just ask you a few other questions here. What does the term sustainability mean to you? And we ask this of all our guests because we get a wide variety of answers, and it's a term that I think is interpreted differently. So, when you hear it as it relates to your thoughts and definition of it, what does it mean?
Well, sustainability is a term that is so widely used now, and as they say, it means different things to different people. To me, if something is to be sustainable, if a society or an environment is to be sustainable, then it needs to continue in its current trajectory without serious degradation that's going to undercut the long-term longevity of that. But not everyone uses the term in that way at all. So there are most universities at this point, ours for sure, have centers for sustainability, and a lot of what they research, I don't think, is necessarily making us into a planet or a society that's going to have much of a long-term future at all.
Oh, well, great. I'm going to ask you a question that wasn't on the list, but I'll give you another little bit of commonality between us, a couple of names. So one of my mentors during the same time that Dr. Thiel was yours, and by the way, I never worked with him, but I knew of him. I was working in intertidal ecology in that 1973 time when I was a senior in college with a couple of professors at Irvine, Dr. Sibley and Dr. Lichter.
Oh, yeah,
and,
okay.
And then as I went to Scripps and beyond, my major prof became Dr. Falter, who his professor was Dr. Kitchell, who published the ecology text, and then I became really good friends with Dr. Hassler, who was the guy who published all the articles in Scientific American about homing behavior and pheromones and so on. But there's a couple of names that I think you might know of at least who became really great mentors. One of them is still so today, although he's ailing in health. They come from your area of the country. So Doctors Todd, well actually Dr. Todd, right. John Todd,
yeah,
and then
John Todd pretty well.
Right, and then Bob Rodale. So the guys who founded New Alchemy. And so if you say you know John, that's great. And I've spent a lot of time with John and also with his son Jonathan now. And as you may know, John's not in great health today. So hopefully he gets a little bit better moving ahead here. So
yeah.
Anyway, again, comparable places, and it's probably not totally unlikely that we didn't run into each other at a conference somewhere along the way.
Probably have.
So related to that, just because I brought up some names that meant something, and maybe you're already going to tell us the name, but is there a person in the green movement, sustainability field, or an environmental area that's had a really profound impact on your life? Who is it? And tell us a little bit about why. And maybe you've already done that a little bit with Dr. Thiel.
No, I've already alluded to it. I think probably George Woodwell would be the #1 person.
Okay.
And George is a practicing scientist. He's still alive. He's in his early 90s. He's still mentally healthy and active. He's not so active as a scientist anymore, but he did a bunch of incredible science over his life. He was one of the people who really pushed climate change on early. I did that internship with him in 1973 while an undergrad. After I got my PhD, I also did a postdoc with him and then worked for him as a staff scientist for quite a while, and I've kept in touch with him. And part of my very first job was to help him teach a institutional graduate class on climate change back in 1980 that we did with Yale and Harvard and MIT and a few other institutions for a month in Woods Hole. George also, what did he do? He helped on the banned DDT movement. He did some of the pioneering work on how radioactivity affects ecological communities. He's one of the people who helped found the Natural Resources Defense Council and Environmental Defense Fund, those sort of active organizations. So there are many other scientists who've been hugely important in my life. Gene Likens, who helped discover acid rain, would certainly be one. Dave Schindler, who did pioneering whole ecosystem experiments on lakes to look at nutrient pollution and all, became a later mentor. Actually, after I was already a tenured associate professor, I started working with him, but he helped influence a lot of my thinking since then.
Well, those are all world-class names, and so that's really cool. Well, why don't you go ahead now and expand on your views on pollution from oil and gas industry, your thoughts on global climate change, its urgency. I think it relates directly to your PowerPoint, and and I thought a really exciting one, and either weave it into the PowerPoint or we can talk about it separately, is the views that you've got on how the court system is allowing confidentiality that the oil and gas industry uses to keep the public and policymakers in the dark, which is something I just think our listeners ought to.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that some more. I mean, my first experience was with that Norton Sound case back in 1993, and I was horrified. But I had signed a contract. I was working for the Alaska Legal Services and the Native American corporations, basically, and I signed a contract saying I would abide by their rules of evidence. And what they did was to settle out of court for what they wanted. The Native people's know what they wanted. Norton Sound is protected, although no one in the world understands why, because it was all secret. But ARCO got what they wanted too by covering up their trails. And, we were lucky to be able to stumble on their files and find the extent of their distortion. I mean, for years, they've been falsifying records to the Environmental Protection Agency. And I suspect that the industry generally does that. An awful lot of the regulation of the oil and gas industry is to government agencies, and it's very difficult to check the accuracy of that. So if you look at the high volume hydraulic fracturing that's going on to get gas out of shale gas, this new phenomenon that sort of exploded over the last 5 to 10 years. If you look at what's going on, say, in Colorado, I'm sure, but also in Pennsylvania, closer to the details, there's plenty of evidence that aquifers are being contaminated and things like that, but most of that evidence is secret because, again, industry will work out of court secret deals with individuals in order to solve their problems. So the public is kept in the dark. I think it's a huge problem.
Well, and let's segue back into your presentation from that by just a brief little vignette from me. I was involved with a rancher in western South Dakota that ended up lasting almost 15 years. It ended up basically causing him to lose everything he had gained throughout his life financially because he was so committed to it. And it was actually never adjudicated. It was settled. The wildcatter that was involved ultimately did admit culpability. However, the details, again, were secret. I was an expert, so I can't even talk about those, obviously. But what I can talk about is the fact that this is a guy who worked his entire adult life to buy a ranch in western South Dakota where all he wanted to do is to run cattle. And this was in 1979 and 1980. And he acquired the ranch. He came in and he took about 15 springs that had literally just sort of through the years stopped flowing. He brought them back to life. He brought cattle into the area. And then all of a sudden, one morning, he woke up and there were drilling. Wow. And he had not realized that in the West, United States, mineral rights are held separate from property rights, and he didn't have the mineral rights. And this company was well within its rights to show up and do what they were doing. What they weren't within their rights for, and it actually involved fracturing. They were doing the early stages of fracking, was to do it improperly. And the oil formation was called the Shannon, and the Eagle, and it was a deep formation. The aquifer was the Fox Hills, and it was more shallow. Basically, through their fracking activity, they created a connection between the gas and the aquifer with the water in it, and that gas was moving upward into the aquifer. The water was seeping downward. So two things happened. One, the springs dried up, and two, his water began to look like 7-Up. Which ultimately ended up in an explosion that blew his house up. And then lastly ended up in what consumed another 15 years of his life trying to win a case, which, like I said, ended up with him losing almost everything financially, but getting a victory in his mind because he did get this awareness. But again, most of it was not publicly known. So anyway, so a good segue back to your PowerPoint. So Leigh-Ann's going to put up the next slide here. And why don't you just take us through it?
And what I'd like to do is to just bring your audience up to speed a little bit on some of the latest information on climate change, and then talk a little bit about methane and some of the work we've been doing on that. And I should say, I've talked about my earlier years on oil pollution in the oil and gas industry, and I mentioned that way back in my thesis work, I looked at some natural sources of methane. Most of the time, the past couple of decades, I've been doing other types of research. We work on coastal nutrient pollution and how it affects seagrass beds, and we work on the sources of nutrient pollution that cause the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico from the Mississippi River Basin and those sorts of things. But I've always been interested in climate change. I've continued to teach climate change, and I've continued to think about methane, and so that's just sort of come together in some series of papers we've published over the last few years, and that's what I want to walk you through. So slide 11. And this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, from their last synthesis report. It came out just a year ago this month. And the IPCC has been an international body, part of the United Nations. They've been forging scientific consensus on climate change going back decades now. And every 5 years or so, they put out a new sort of synthesis report. So this is their newest and latest one. And what this slide shows you is that the temperature of the Earth's average temperature is indeed rising, has been rising, and that each of the last 3 decades has been the warmest ever in recorded history. And of course, you have to go back hundreds of thousands of years or more in order to find temperatures that are comparable. So climate change is real, it's with us, it's going on. We go to slide 12. This is also from the IPCC report. And what I want you to look at is a busy little slide. I'll show you another aspect of it in a minute. But this is what a climate scientist calls the radiative forcing, the amount of warming power that's coming from the various gases and substances that human society puts into the atmosphere. And at the bottom is a summary of those radiative forcing. This is the heat trapping capacity of the atmosphere due to human increases in gases in the atmosphere. At 3 points in time, I was really struck when I saw this, because the times they show are 1950, 1980, and then up to 2011, more or less the present. And 1950, of course, is more or less when you and I were born. And 1980 is when I taught that first course on climate change. And during that time period, the radiative forcing of the atmosphere had already doubled due to human-caused pollution. And yet, since 1980 until the present, we haven't really done much to address climate change, and so it's doubled again, and 4 times higher now than when you and I were born back in the early 1950s. So, pretty rapid rate of change. The next slide, number 13, is just for people who are skeptical about whether humans are causing climate change. You should not be skeptical. Humans are causing climate change, and that's those greenhouse gas emissions and that cumulative radiating forcing that's grown fourfold over our lifetimes. There are other things going on with climate. There's volcanic eruptions and changes in solar activity and things, so there are a lot of things controlling the planet's temperature. But what this shows is, on the bottom there, the blue, what the temperature of the Earth would have been over time if humans had not been increasing greenhouse gases. And then the top shows a model of what happens when you throw in those greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, that well matches up with the actual warming we're seeing. So a lot of things are going on, but the warming we're seeing is driven by greenhouse gases. The planet would have been cooling over the last 50 years or so otherwise. Next slide, number 14. Just the major driver behind climate change is our addiction to fossil fuels. And George Whittle is correct that things like deforestation of the Amazon contribute, but they're not the biggest player. The biggest problem is our fossil fuel use. And we continue to use fossil fuels at an amazing rate. So clearly we have to break out of that if we're getting anywhere. And what I want to spend a little bit of time with you on now is how we break out of there. And there are 2 ideas I'm going to run with. One is the concept that natural gas, which increasingly means shale gas from hydraulic fracturing, but natural gas is somehow a bridge fuel that would allow society to continue to use fossil fuels and yet reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And industry loves this idea. Some of the big environmental groups like the idea. President Obama has promoted this idea. So we'll talk about that, and then I'll come back and suggest that the better way forward is really to move as quickly as we can to renewable energy. But let's go to the bridge fuel idea first. So slide 15. And the basis of this is that to get the same amount of energy from different fuels, produce different amounts of carbon dioxide. And this shows the amount of carbon dioxide as grams of carbon to get a megajoule of energy from natural gas, diesel, or from coal. And natural gas, as the industry loves to tell you, is a clean-burning fuel, so less carbon dioxide to produce the same amount of energy. And so the idea that a bridge fuel comes about, we can convert from coal to natural gas. The President is actively promoting that at the moment as a solution to climate change for the country. Not as radical as trying to move towards truly renewable sources. I first became familiar with this idea maybe about half a dozen years ago. I started paying close attention to it for 5 years ago as the shale gas revolution started to happen, because the shale gas is increasingly the source of natural gas, and I was just wondering if this really could be good for climate change. It didn't entirely ring true. And I think it's not true, and the next slide starts to explain why. Number 16. And it's methane. And again, I've thought about methane ever since my graduate school days, looked at some of the natural fluxes from wetlands, which can be significant. But natural gas, whether from conventional sources or shale, is mostly methane, 85, 90, 95% methane. Methane is the second largest, second most important greenhouse gas behind carbon dioxide. It's actually over 100 times more potent in absorbing infrared radiation and heating the planet per mass than is carbon dioxide. So it's a very potent greenhouse gas. And that means that even small methane emissions make a big difference. Let's hop ahead 2 slides actually and go to the number 18 here. In between, what I'm not showing you is just that the amount of methane in the atmosphere has been going up pretty steadily over the time of the Industrial Revolution. It continues. But what I want to show you again here on slide 18 is from the IPCC report. I showed you this slide a minute ago, focusing at the bottom. The top, this shows that currently carbon dioxide is the major source of global warming, about 1.66 watts heat absorption per square meter. But methane's pretty close at about 1. It's not a distant second in terms of its importance in global warming. Very important greenhouse gas. So what I and some other colleagues at Cornell did, notably Tony and Gracia, was to start to estimate how much methane is emitted, particularly from shale gas as it's developed, from conventional natural gas too, and all the way from drilling and the sort of leaks you were talking about before, to the processing of gas delivery to cities, and buildings blow up in cities now and then too. We clearly have gas leaks in cities. We estimated how much methane that is compared to carbon dioxide, and the next slide is my most recent summary on it. We published a paper on this in spring of 2011, and surprisingly, it was really the first time that anyone had published a comprehensive analysis of the role of methane leakage in the greenhouse gas footprint of shale gas. No one had looked at it. So promoting this idea that it's good gas from a climate standpoint, but without really looking at methane. We got a lot of pushback and criticism from industry. There's been a lot of science since then. I think our science has held up quite well, but rather than boring you with all the details of that, I wanted to show you a most recent summary that we published just a few months ago with the most recent science from the IPCC report and the best and most recent estimates of methane leakage. So on slide 19 here, what we're looking at is to compare the greenhouse gas footprint of natural gas with diesel oil, with coal. And the orange bars are the carbon dioxide emissions to get a unit of energy. And the red is the methane component of that greenhouse gas footprint converted to carbon dioxide equivalent using the protocol of the IPCC. So if you ignore the methane, you can say, oh yeah, okay, natural gas is a better fuel than these others from a climate standpoint. But if you include methane emissions, it's not. It has a much larger greenhouse gas footprint, in fact. So we concluded, next slide, 20, that natural gas is not a bridge fuel. It's a bridge to nowhere. And I want to give you just a little bit of sense of some of the politics since then. I've published about 200 scientific papers in my career. Never with the sort of intensity of feedback that this one got. Usually, you'd be lucky if 100 people read your paper over your lifetime. If people are going to write follow-up, it might take them years. In this case, there have been about 35 papers published that have commented on our paper since it was published 3 years ago, and many of those came out in the first 3 to 4 months, which is just really unfortunate, sort of orchestrated attempt to discredit us. The paper's held up pretty well, but we did get a huge amount of pushback, a huge amount of attention. Slide 21 is just one way to illustrate this. Over 1,400 newspapers covered our paper when it was first published within the first month. New York Times had it on the front page. And so Tony and Graffy and I were named as some of the runners-up for Time People of the Year in 2011, not because we're good people, but because of our newsworthiness of our paper. Just to prove that it has nothing to do with being a good person, go to slide 22. And we can look at some of the other runners-up here in Persons of the Year. You can choose your favorite there, but Vladimir Putin is there, Osama bin Laden are also some of the 50 runners-up with Tony and Graffy and I. So it's all like newsworthiness. Anyway, huge amount of pushback from industry. They certainly continue to try and discredit me, but a lot of other scientists have gotten engaged. And the IPCC has a pretty good job of endorsing much of what we said at this point in time. Let's go to slide 23. And if you and your audience talking with me, I'd like you to remember this slide. I think it's one of the most important slides I've seen, or some perhaps ever. It's a work by Drew Shindell, who was working for NASA Goddard Space Institute at the time. He's now professor at Duke. He and colleagues published this back in 2012. And what it shows the rate of warming of the planet over most of the 20th century, a jagged line up until 2011, and then some projections, and we can see the global warming here, and then 4 projections for what the planet might look like over the next several decades into the future. And there are the yellow bar there, which they mean to highlight as a warning area, a red bar, which is an area of extreme heating. The worry is that if we get into those yellow to red areas, that we may hit tipping points in the climate system, and have some runaway global warming that will be beyond human control. And the many government agencies, the IPCC and other UN agencies are now warning that we're on that trajectory, based in part on this figure. So let me show you the 4 scenarios there, which they cover. The top one is the reference scenario. That's if society continues to do as we're doing and not take any action to control climate change. And if we do that, we'll hit these dangerous temperatures within the next 15 to 35 years, that sort of time frame. The next slide down there, which says here CO2 measures, is what will happen if society were to have started aggressively back in 2011 controlling carbon dioxide emissions, but ignored methane and other gases. And because of lags in the climate change system, it really doesn't do us any good for the next several decades. It's important to do that, but it doesn't do anything in terms of slowing the warming over the next, say, 30 years or so. And we still will hit dangerous potential tipping point in the climate system in the time frame of the next 15 to 35 years, pretty soon. The bottom 2 lines are what and also soot, what's called black carbon on this slide. And the climate system responds much more quickly to those. So even if we ignore carbon dioxide, which we shouldn't, we need to control all gases, but we can slow the rate of warming significantly if we control methane emissions. So we need to do that in order to buy ourselves some time and figure out how else to adapt to the climate change system. So where's methane coming from? Well, the number 1 source of methane in the atmosphere is the natural gas industry. So this idea of promoting it to somehow reduce carbon dioxide emissions is just a really disastrous idea.
Before you go on to the next slide, just because I know we hear this, we're out here in the farming West. So you mean to say that methane from natural gas is a bigger supply than from cows?
Let's jump ahead to slide number 27, and then I'll come back to 24.
Okay.
There's uncertainty. These are the latest, and to my mind, best estimates of where methane's coming from globally in terms of teragram kilograms of methane per year, so 10 to the from the whole planet per year. We have natural sources. Some of those wetland sources that I measured in my thesis are important, but total natural sources are about 220 kilograms. Anthropogenic sources are bigger. Now, unlike carbon dioxide, where natural systems still have more influence than human sources, humans are dominating the methane change. And there's uncertainty in these numbers, but the number one, that's almost entirely the natural gas industry. Your cows and all are number two, and not that far down there. That's the planet as a whole. In the United States, the difference between natural gas and cows and animal agriculture is larger, simply because we're such an important part of the global natural gas production. And so, you know, the message is we want to control methane emissions from both animal agriculture and from the natural gas systems. Those are the top two emitters, and you know, how should we do that? Well, I would personally close down the natural gas industry as quickly as I could, and there are a bunch of things we could do to reduce methane emissions from cows as well. Changes in manure handling systems are the number one, but paying more attention to diet is also a useful thing to do.
Awesome. So you want to backtrack back. By the way, we try to, I'm just going to give a little thought. We try to stay fairly good with our viewers and try to wrap this up about in an hour. And actually, normally this isn't a big deal to me at all, but I actually have another appointment, or another call that I have to be on right around 2. So you got about 10 minutes here, and we'll try to wrap her up. So.
No problem. Let's go to slide 24, and I'll wrap it up in 5 minutes, probably 5 or 6. This slide is just to illustrate one of the potential tipping points. As we start to warm the planet, as we've already warmed the planet, there are a variety of changes that are happening, but one of them is that we're changing Arctic systems. We're melting permafrost. There's huge amounts of organic carbon stored in frozen soils in the Arctic, and as we warm that, we're releasing some of that as carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, accelerating that cycle. We're also producing a lot of methane from bacteria that do that naturally, but they wouldn't have been doing it naturally if we had not caused that warming of the tundra. And the next slide is just to demonstrate that this is happening. These are data pulled together by National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and what they show is that over the last 20 years, we've lost almost 20% of the world's tundra. It's been warmed, the permafrost has melted, and we've converted a lot of that, some of it to forest, but a lot of it to wetlands, which will greatly increase that flux of methane and get into this sort of runaway spiral of warming we're worried about. The next slide shows 2 pictures of what's involved there. The upper left one is a particular area in Alaska taken 20 years ago, and the one to the lower right is the same area taken more recently. Tundra has become wetland due to global warming over that time frame, and with that, there's a lot more increase in those quote-unquote natural sources of methane. So I think we have to reduce methane fluxes from human sources. Natural gas, number one, let's get rid of that as a fuel. How do we move forward? And let's just jump to slide 29. I'll just quickly sum up why I think we have an alternative. We've been working with Mark Jacobson as a professor of engineering at Stanford, and Mark's been thinking for a long time about how to transition the world to a completely renewable future and do so fairly quickly. We worked with him to produce 2 years ago a detailed plan on how to do that for the state of New York, and then this year we published a sequel on how to do that for the state of California. And let me just run through the plan very quickly. Slide 30. The plan is to get rid of all fossil fuels, not just for electricity, but for vehicles and for home heating and for industry. Replace it with renewable electricity and higher efficiency uses of energy. The point I want to emphasize is that our plan calls for using only technologies that are commercially available today, and for the most part, technologies that are economically feasible today. These are not extravagant ideas. So this is technically possible to get rid of fossil fuels largely by 2030. Slide 31. we estimate that it would cost about $570 billion to do this for the state of New York, and that's a big number. But I'd like to point out that currently we're spending $33 billion a year in the state of New York on deaths and health issues from people who are injured by air pollution from fossil fuel industries. So in fact, if we get rid of the fossil fuel pollution, that alone would pay for this transition over 17 years. So it's affordable, huge increase in jobs, hugely good for the environment. Slide 32, the summary on that, just to show the time trajectory. We think it's technically possible and economically feasible, in a way it's desirable for the state of New York to get rid of most fossil fuels by 2030, and then take another 15, 20 years to finalize the plan, but we can move there pretty quickly. And when I've given talks on this elsewhere, and when I talk to politicians, people go, well, it's just not possible for any societal transition to happen that fast. So my final slide for you, number 33, is just to show a historical example of a transition which did happen that fast, and that's the change from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles in the United States. Basically, if you go back to 1900, 1910, this is a log scale. 1910, cars were making up less than 1% of transportation for people in the United States, overwhelmingly horses. 15 years later, cars were making up 95% of our transportation, and horses were on their way out. So that was a massive transition that happened very quickly. The reasons for converting our energy systems are much more compelling than switching that transportation system. I think it can be done. I think it must be done. So I appreciate the chance to be talking with you about it today, and that's what I wanted to say.
Bob, that was just awesome. And we've got a couple of minutes here, and if we've got any questions out there, you can throw them in the chat. Bob, I'm assuming that if we get some questions in our replay that we do here, if I have Leigh-Ann or myself communicate with you, that you might be able to help us with some answers.
Absolutely.
This has been awesome, and I'd really like to even, like I said, do a follow-up with you just professionally and personally. And let's just end on this. First, everybody know that in 2 weeks we'll have another one of our webinars, and please tune in again, and if you can't be live, listen to replays. But would you tell us, kind of to end here, what can our listeners do? What can we do to help with making this transition as you ended your talk? And realize we have a lot of people that are in college now that are going to be listening. They're looking to create their careers. We have interns that will be here over the next year that I know every one of them will have interest here, and they're going to want to know what can we do as we move ahead.
I think there's a huge number of opportunities for people who are in college now or looking for careers into the future. Building this renewable energy technology, making this revolution happen, and also the agricultural changes which we need to make to reform how we grow cows to make them healthier and reduce methane emissions. But on the energy side of it, people focus on solar installations and wind installations, and that's certainly an important part of it. But there's so much more you could do. One of the low-hanging fruits is to replace the in-home use of fossil fuels, whether it be oil or natural gas, with modern high-efficiency heat pumps. And even if they're run on electricity that's coming from coal, their greenhouse gas footprint is far less than using oil or gas in a home. And the design that needs to be done to make that happen, the education, those things are cost-effective. And I put one heat pump that paid for itself in about 18 months, and just economically, to get my greenhouse gas footprint. I'm putting one in to completely make my home free of fossil fuels over this coming fall, and I think the payback period there will be about 7.5 or 8 years. But there's a lot of work involved in getting that done. There's a lot of ignorance out there about how these things work. I just think there's a huge amount of opportunity for engineers and builders and policy people and lawyers, rewriting some of the regulations to make this easier to do. Huge opportunity.
Well, Bob, that's just awesome, and we really are coming up against it here. So I think I'll I'll say goodbye. And again, thank you so much for taking time out of your day and helping us. Please, everybody, be out there. And Leigh-Ann usually takes about a day to get it edited. And Bob, again, she'll connect with you to make sure it's available for you. You can even talk to your students and others. It's funny that speakers who they have it to their their local constituency and they enjoy it, and they also get some laughs out of it too. They see people in a different setting. So your grad students will probably be the toughest on you on it than anybody. But anyway, you're doing a wonderful thing for the planet. That's one of the things we always talk about is economics, which is what one of my friends, Dennis Weaver, coined that word, which is doing things that we can that make the planet better in a sustainable sort of way, and then showing people how they can make a little money doing it, as we say. So the synergy of ecology and economy, and here's a big one where Dr. Howarth ended up by telling us some things that we could be doing. Like I said, I'd love to schedule another time, and we'll try to do that where maybe we focus on that back end of this. I mean, there's lots of little things I would have asked you about. The people up in Idaho are talking about, the PV-related roadways that we could be doing, solar roads, and just all kinds of things. And then I have 2 geothermal heat pumps that I do all the electrical for a dwelling that we created. And there's just so many things we can be doing. So, Bob, we thank you so much. Appreciate it. We'll sign off to our audience here. Thank you so much for all that you guys are listening. And we'll talk to you again in a couple weeks. Thanks, Bob. All right. Bye-bye.